Our first plenary speaker is Michaela Mahlberg. Michaela Mahlberg is Professor of Corpus Linguistics and Director of the Centre for Corpus Research at the University of Birmingham. She's the editor of the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics and co-editor of the Corpus and Discourse book series. Michaela's research focuses on the interface of language and literature, and we at Aston in the Department of English, Languages and Applied Linguistics do also have quite an interest in stylistics. She's specifically interested in speech and body language in Victorian fiction, especially Dickens, textual cohesion, discourse analysis and literary translation. She's also part, quite interestingly, of the Birmingham Plastics Network, an interdisciplinary team of more than 40 academics working together to shape the fate and sustainable future of plastics. And most recently, I've observed that Michaela is also the host of a brand new podcast called Life and Language, a podcast about life and why language matters. As a member of a fellow Birmingham-based university, I'm very happy that Michaela accepted our invitation to talk to us today. Unfortunately, as you have probably gathered, Michaela unfortunately can't be with us here in person, but I'm very grateful to Michaela for joining us live via Zoom to share her plenary talk. And so, Michaela Mahlberg, thank you very much for joining us. And if you're able to share your slides on your screen, I will pass the floor to you. Thank you, Michaela.
Thank you, Robbie. That was such a nice introduction, and thank you so much for having me. And hello, everyone in Aston and across all the places you are. It's such a shame that this time, I mean, you're just down the road, and for some reason I had to make travel arrangements so that I couldn't be in Birmingham at this particular time. But I am very much there in spirit, and I really enjoyed, Ramesh, the introduction that you gave. Okay, what I want to do today is I want to look at corpus linguistics in a bit of a, very much in the spirit of Ramesh as well, thinking about where we are at this point in time and thinking about what we might have to do for the future. So I called this talk Rethinking Corpus Linguistics in the Digital Age, because we all talk about digital quite a lot. To start off, I wanted to look a little bit at language in the digital age, because now that everything is happening on computers and already started before the pandemic made it a lot harder for us, we now have new ways of how we read books. So I can now read to my son on an iPad when we're stuck somewhere in traffic, when my husband is driving, I hasten to say, or we can look at the language that we have around images, especially on Twitter. We see how short ways of commenting, almost like captioning on images, becomes a particular way of using language. We can also see how we write text messages. And here, this is an example of something my son keeps laughing about quite a lot, because it tells you how old you are, depending on how you write text messages, doesn't it? So the people who send you messages like this are probably not teenagers anymore. Then we can do things like quickly check something on Google Translate. And then there are also these very annoying things like these chatbots, which I really don't like a lot. So here, this is one. The reason why I don't like this one is it just says, Hallo und willkommen bei Stackfuel. Hast du eine Frage? So for the German speakers, I wouldn't, if I go into a shop, I wouldn't want people to say, Hast du eine Frage? I would like to hear people say, Haben Sie eine Frage? And these chatbots are crossing a line in this regard, I think. So anyway, language in the digital age is changing and adjusting in very many ways. And this might also have implications for how we see ourselves as corpus linguists, what we want to do and how we think we probably fit into all this development. So with language, the thing is, it's really everyone's language. So that is not new, that isn't particularly digital. Language has always been generally evaluated and commented on. So if you read the book Verbal Hygiene by Debbie Cameron, you are quite familiar with this idea that everyone has got something to say about language. People debate whether something is good or bad grammar, whether a word should be in the dictionary, whether schools should ban certain ways of saying something. And you probably followed the little spat that Marcello got in at some point about, what people view as appropriate language in schools or not. And then there are these things around training and advice. It is amazing how many courses are offered on how to speak, how to behave in interviews. Especially, there's a lot of advice for women to tell them how to speak with more confidence or almost more like a man and things like this. And there are now also lots of tools in business where you can quickly analyze language in a company or analyze customer feedback, and even things like, you can get feedback from your customers via video interviews. And then there is AI supported technology that helps you then quickly get little nuggets from these interviews and get a view of how people view your company and your products. So the bottom line is really language isn't just for linguists. We just have a particular way of looking at it and studying it. And that has always been the case. And it's no different now when we have a lot of language data. So in the digital world, what definitely has changed, while before collecting a corpus was quite a job, because there was a time when you actually had to key in from documents, and OCR wasn't as good as it is today, and there wasn't as much born digital data as we have today. But now everyone's got data. Every company kind of analyzes their own data. Institutions have their data. You can get everything from the web that you like. And so it isn't just everyone's language, but in a sense, it's also everyone's language data. What you then have is that disciplines like data science, machine learning, AI come in and do a lot of things with this data. There are a lot of commercial tools and data services available. So you can just go on the web and there's surely someone offering you to do a quick topic modeling analysis of some of the things that you might want to look at. People do sentiment analysis quickly. You can get your word clouds, and companies always have things on offer for you to quickly analyze. And here, the Google Ngram viewer, that is something everyone is familiar with. So if you happen to do a study on superheroes, like you sometimes might want to do, you can just check Google Ngram viewer and see how frequencies have developed over time for this. Okay, so language data is not just of interest to linguists. So what you can find is in a lot of disciplines, people are looking at the data that we have now and think about, what can I do with this data in my particular area? So I looked at, luckily I had a bit of research leave, so I spent a lot of time reading across very many disciplines to see how do people deal with data. And then you have people in sociology who say it's really, we need to look at computational social science and see what happens with text data. Then there are people who emphasize it's really about working together across disciplines so that we can see what we can make of computational text analysis and see what we get out of this. Then there's this whole discipline in digital humanities where people look at literary and cultural history. And there are now all sorts of areas in linguistics and related fields where you can add something like computer assisted or computational, and you then get a new area of research. So there's a lot of computational terms. And what struck me is how often or how little such ideas, such views, such new approaches connect to corpus linguistics. Why is that so? What do we do in our disciplines so that people are very keen on the computational. But why is it so difficult to make this cross connection between, let's say, sociology and corpus linguistics? Very often when you read stuff in these other fields, it's a bit like reinventing the wheel. People are saying things that to us sound very, very natural. We've looked at this for 20, 30 years, and it comes across as there's a completely new insight in a new field. So I'm not criticizing these other fields. I'm saying it's a good thing that people are looking at language and language data. I'm just wondering what we as corpus linguists can do to get our message across better so that more people get interested in how we look at the language. A question there is, has corpus linguistics kept pace with computational innovation? And I'm really pleased very much that you did this introduction, because I don't have the time to do a full historical overview. But one thing I wanted to say is, if you look at the stories that people used to tell at conferences, so it's now, I think this year, it's exactly 20 years since I started my PhD and started going to conferences. And then you had people like John Sinclair, Jeff Leach, and people who've been there really right from the beginning. And they told you these stories about how difficult it was to run data on mainframe computers and how complicated things were. And that was really quite exciting, because you felt you were at the beginning or somewhere in a narrative, as Ramesh says, where things really were changing. And then if you look at the textbook by McHenry and Hardy, they look at corpus tools across generations, and you can really see how things have changed from the mainframes to what we have today as a web interface to do a corpus analysis. However, if you look at all of this, if we compare this to what happens in data science and computer science and the kind of capabilities that people have there in terms of storage, space, speed, the algorithms that they use, how would corpus linguistics compare to this? And also, if we look at it in terms of the user experience, a lot of the interfaces that we have, or a lot of the way the tools look that we use, they're still very, very similar to how they used to be. And now the question is, does this mean that we are kind of behind the curve, or what is going on here? And I very clearly want to say it is not about the flashy tools. I think, yes, we can probably use a few of the things that are out there, and we can modernize some of the things that we do. But what is important in all of this is that we need to focus on the linguistic insight. The interesting thing is, when corpus linguistics started, it was all about the computer introducing new things. You could count, there were frequencies, you could look at concordances. This was new, this gave you new insights. And I think what we probably need to do now, when we rethink where we are in the digital age, is focus more on the linguistic, in the sense of telling others about the linguistic insights that you can get from corpora. A while ago, Michael Stubbs said, the central program of corpus linguistics is to develop a theory of meaning. That was something that was really quite strong at that time, thinking about, if we look at meaning differently, what can we get from corpus linguistics? And John Sinclair, he had this idea of the extended unit of meaning, or the lexical item. And here are various years in which he's published about this. The 2004 book is basically a summary of the earlier publications. And then there's Michael Howey's book, Lexical Priming, which he explicitly calls a new theory of words and language. Then we had this debate about corpus-based versus corpus-driven, and people got so upset about, is corpus linguistics just a methodology, or is corpus linguistics a theory in itself? And can you have a theory based on corpus methods? And somehow this whole debate, corpus-based versus corpus-driven, this has run its course. So I think people have realized it isn't an either or. It's almost, it's a sliding scale that you have there. And you can use corpus linguistics as a method in very many areas. But there's also something to be said about what are theoretical insights that we can get because of corpus linguistics. And more recently, a lot of work has been done in terms of meaning in discourses. So a lot of people that you know very well, like Tony McHenry, Paul Baker, Gavin Brooks, Elena Semino. You know, we have Mike Scott did work with Rainer Grundmann in a very similar area. Ramesh has done stuff in this regard. So very many of us have looked at meaning in discourses, and that is something that is getting increasingly important. And the discourses now change as well, because the discourses become much more digital because of the kind of language that we have in them as well. So what I wanted to do, and that connects very well with the idea of a bit of nostalgia, a bit of looking at the narrative, but also then bringing it back to the present time. I wanted to revisit this idea of the lexical item that we had from John Sinclair, because one thing that always struck me is John had wonderful examples when he introduced the lexical item. And funnily enough, a lot of people quote exactly his examples. So they use his same examples to illustrate the concept. And I'm guilty of this myself, because the thing is, he'd chosen such good ways of illustrating it that it just works perfectly. And it's quite difficult to find other examples that illustrate these components of the lexical item in quite the same way. So I want to look back at one of his examples, and then I want to look at some other examples and see how we can possibly make connections. So for those of you, I think most people are probably familiar with this concept, but there might also be people who are just starting out in corpus linguistics. So I briefly summarize what John had in mind with this. For him, a lexical item, that he also calls an extended unit of meaning, basically has 5 components, and 2 of them always have to be there. So you need to have a core, which is basically the word or the combination of words that you put into a concordance. So the node word, where you then can look at the left, on the left and on the right to see what context you have. And you need a semantic prosody, which he refers to as an attitudinal or an evaluative meaning, which is basically the function of the item in context, the reason why the item is chosen. And then in between, you have various ways of describing repeated patterns around your core. And you need to see an example, and I start off with his example because this is familiar and also will raise some questions. So here we have an example that he used repeatedly, which is true feelings, this combination. And if you look at concordances for true feelings, and here I've taken one that is from newspaper language, you see you've got your node and then you've got your collocates in the context, and words are repeated. So you've got verbatim repetition. So you've got things like doubt or hide, and then about, and you have things like his or her that occur repeatedly. Okay, so for the lexical item, you would then describe these just as collocations, words that occur repeatedly in the context of the search word. If you then try to categorize the words in the context according to grammatical categories, the first one you look at is here the possessives, and then you can call them, that's a colligation of this category of possessives with true feelings. So what's happening is you go up a level of abstraction. You don't just have the words that are repeated in a verbatim fashion, but you see whether you can group them together and come up with another category. Then John Sinclair talks about the semantic preference, which is a way of grouping words in the context around the node according to the semantic field they come from. So here you've got verbs or expressions that have to do with revealing, expressing, making true feelings known. So it's this idea, there's a meaning of expression when you talk about true feelings. And then there's the semantic prosody. So this is more difficult because it is kind of evaluative. And what is evaluative? That's a difficult one, and I could do a whole talk on this, but I don't have time to go into the detail. The evaluative idea is that you can group words together that give you a sense of what's the attitude towards that term. So here it's not about true feelings as expressing them, but it's about the difficulty of expressing them. People don't want to express them. They're trying to hide them. So that is what you get there. Now, this looks all very easy and straightforward. And the reason why that is so is true feelings is not a very, very frequent expression in large corpora. So I looked at true feelings in the BNC and I used Sketch Engine for this, and I did a word sketch, and then you get all these verbs here in your word sketch, and they already look quite helpful in terms of constructing this lexical item. And the reason why I'm using word sketch is that Michael Rundle has written an article and saying, okay, now we have these extended lexical units. How do we actually go through step by step to finding more of them? And he argues that the word sketches in Sketch Engine can already go quite a long way. And if you then run a concordance for these verbs, ta-da, here you see really what you want to see. So you've got forced her to confront her true feelings, or finds it difficult to show her true feelings. So really like textbook-like, you see the examples for this particular lexical item. So this sounds all very convincing, and we can find a few more of these items if you look carefully for not too frequent ones. But then what do we do with something like the word water? So water is a word that's a lot more frequent. So if you look at the BNC, and I'm still using the old BNC because in 2 weeks' time, there's the launch of the new BNC, and then I probably have to redo all of this, but that's still old BNC. And there, water is quite frequent, and running concordances for something like this and then trying to find the lexical item can be really rather tiresome. So I tried looking at water first in a very narrow selection. So this is water, a couple of lines retrieved with WebCorp. So WebCorp here focuses on basically articles from The Guardian. I ran this search in October 2019 before the pandemic, and that is important, keep in mind, before the pandemic. And WebCorp always gives you data that is very recent to your search date and doesn't give you too long a time period. So therefore, what you then see is you can find patterns here like water cannon, water fountains, water park, water pollution, where the patterns are partly due to the fact that you've run your search at a particular point in time. So here you also have above, when we then have the third line, it says the Hurricane Dorian, and that was in that particular period of time, I think around 2 months of when I ran that search. So you can really see how you get topical stuff, and that also helps with seeing patterns. The patterns that I've shown you here in green are ones that are less easily findable by looking at verbatim repetitions. And these are patterns that have to do with food and pollution and here microplastics. Here comes the plastics, the thing that Robbie mentioned in the beginning, and then policies and things that have to do with environmental issues. And these meanings, sometimes they are in water pollution straight away, but sometimes they are in the wider context in your concordance. Okay, and keep this in mind, the wider context of your concordance. Another way of almost downsampling, finding ways of looking at water so that you can see patterns better is I also looked at water in a corpus of children's literature. So because I spend a lot of time looking at fiction, and children's fiction is an area I've looked at before. And if you study water in fiction for children, what you find is there are quite some neat patterns. So you can use water to talk about places. So you have, something is happening along by the water or down by the water, or there's an open space by the water. It's like a place reference. You can also have things like, considering that it's children's literature, and if you think about how child protagonists behave, there's a lot of falling into the water as well. So because you've got a lot of action verbs and things are happening. You also have things like, drinking water. People think about when they are on adventures, whether they still have enough water in 3 days' time, or people wash with cold water, or things like this. So it's very concrete, and you find some interesting patterns there. So now, what I want to do now in the remaining time that I have is look at water in the sense of water discourses in the context of the water crisis and the climate emergency that we are in. And Ramesh already mentioned at Aston, work into climate change has already been done quite successfully. And this is such an important topic. There's still a lot for us to do. And people at COP are currently talking about all the issues that we have. And I think for linguists, there is quite a lot of work as well. One thing that struck me particularly is we kind of all know what state the world is in. We know that we don't have time. We know that we really need to act fast. But why is it so difficult for people to hear that message? Why is there so much talk about it? And why is this connection so long between hearing something and actually getting to action? So are we maybe not talking about it in the right way so that the message doesn't land properly with people? This also has to do with how we value water. How aware are people of water? What does water mean to them so that they actually feel encouraged to take action? So one of the questions I want to look at, and I'm doing this together with a colleague who works in hydrology, so that's someone for whom water is really the main area of research. How do we need to speak about water so that it matters to people? And before you can start with recommendations, you first need to find out what is actually happening. And here I want to show you some examples. So a connection I want to make between what I just said about the semantic prosody before is thinking about semantic prosodies and evaluation, values, reasons for choosing an item. This all has to do with the kinds of texts you're looking at and also the kinds of value systems you are connecting to. So if you look at news language, for instance, people have talked a lot about news values and newsworthiness. And there's a very good book by Bednarek and Cable that they published in 2017 on this particular issue. And Mike Scott has done a great study on looking at worldviews that are expressed by looking at keywords and keywords and things like this. And so when we look at the discourse, we need to find the connections to the systems for evaluation. So it's basically getting at the semantic prosody further from the outside. So not in the concordance only by looking at your note and then spreading out from there, but also looking at the context in a wider sense. The reason why this is important too is that there's quite an interesting connection between news and science communication, because in scientific terms, we know quite a lot about water and the state the Earth is in, but the way this gets communicated very often gets communicated through news outlets, because people don't just all do a degree in certain scientific subjects, but they get a lot in news and how this is communicated. And so it's important to look at the value systems there too. So I've got some examples today, and these examples are part of a larger study, but that looked like something that I can probably do in the next 10 minutes so that I've got time to round it all off. What we've done is we looked at UK news and got that from LexisNexis. And the examples for today are of the search word water, where we looked at 3,000 articles per year, and for the year 2011 and the year 2020. And that is partly because we're doing the research this year, so we can take last year as a full year, and then we want 10 years, so that is the beginning and the end of that period. What we are looking at is keywords and keywords that we got in comparison to the British National Corpus, and then look at associates. So these are keywords that are associated with the keyword. So there's a lot of key in this. The keyword is a word that is key not just in one of these articles, but in several of these articles. And then the associates for one of these are other keywords that are associated with it. And here association is measured, so not in the collocation sense, so you don't have the small span, but you're really looking at the article. And all this is done with Wordsmith tools, and you can hear more about this ideally from Mike. So here is a table with some of the top of that list of the keywords. And here you obviously, because the way the corpus is collected, we've got water and waters. And then you can see something that's quite striking in terms of the topicality. So waters in plural and coronavirus. the waters, the plural form waters, that has to do with all the Brexit shenanigans that we had last year and probably for a very long time, is here around deals for, fishing rights and UK waters and what happens there. So there's quite a lot in that space. And also we have coronavirus as a key keyword. So the search was done with the search word water, but coronavirus still comes out as a key keyword, so it's key across several texts. This is one because it is topical, but there's also an interesting connection that I hope we have time to look at. If you compare this to 2011, you can already see a bit of a difference. So in 2011, topical things are here, there was a period of drought in this particular time span. So there was particularly 2010 to 2012, when things were very, very dry, and there was a lot of discussion around hose pipe bans and reservoirs getting emptied and all of this. Then Olympic comes up because there were the Olympic Games in 2012, and then people were qualifying, and swimming was just something that got very, very popular. And plant here, that refers to the Fukushima disaster, where there was the earthquake and the explosion in that plant. So you've got the topical stuff, and you also have got other key keywords. Now, what we did is we looked at key keywords and we looked at associates to then try and see whether we can group words together into areas of meanings where we could maybe get a bit of a sense of what kind of values do these connect to, what kind of view of the world is expressed in them, how can we then find out more about the meaning of water in particular areas. So one area that came out of this was, you won't be surprised, is looking at the water crisis, but here looking at it from the point of view of the hydrologist and the way they frame and look at this crisis in terms of there's either too much water, so we've got floods, there's too little when we've got droughts, and there's pollution, so we've got too polluted water. And that is something that we use to look at our examples to then see what we've got. And then you can classify them into even finer terms. So when you look at droughts, for instance, and look at the people who are involved in these stories, droughts, it's often about farmers, and then you've got the water companies who need to talk to their customers about how much to use. And when you talk about floods, it isn't so much farmers and customers, but it's more residents who are affected by this, and then other stakeholders or things like the Environment Agency, because it is about warning systems that work or don't work. So that is one group of meanings. And then, and this is why I liked it so much that Ramesh was talking about narratives, because we also try to look at it in terms of, are there then any changes over time in terms of these relationships? So when you look at droughts in 2011 and 2020, you can see how time plays quite an important role, because in 2011, it was about, immediate risks, things that had to happen next week to prevent things getting worse. And now in 2020, when we talk about droughts, it's very often also retrospectively focusing on after years of droughts or following periods of drought, or thinking about the extended periods or the prolonged ways of it. So it's, narrative is also about looking back at something and then organizing your information in this kind of way. And that is something we started looking at. Then water very often connects to food, health, and leisure. So, there was a whole bunch of associates that have to do with recipes. So now pour in the stock or water and bring to simmer. Or in the context of swimming, open water swimming apparently is getting quite popular. Or then there's something around drinking water where people talk about how many liters or how many glasses a day you should drink so that it's good for you. And then others say this is all nonsense and you don't need to drink as much. So there's a debate around this. Now, the other really interesting thing is that you can also look at water in context, and in contexts where you don't necessarily expect it. And that is a very interesting way, because you can then find new values, new evaluations of something that you thought you knew really rather well. Because water is very concrete. You can have a scientific definition, and therefore it's a particularly interesting thing to look at from a discursive point of view. What you get when you look at the associates of coronavirus, so if coronavirus is a key keyword, and if you look at the keywords that are associated with this in the texts, you get examples like this. So here, I read that one for you. Supermarkets across country are running out of toilet roll. You remember that problem, don't you? Amid panic shoppers. Water companies have urged people not to flush wet wipes and kitchen rolls, as they can cause fatbergs, which block drain pipes. So here, this whole problem of the lockdown, people stockpiling and running out of toilet roll, people then started talking about water also in different ways, thinking about what does this change actually do to the drain pipes that are blocked. So these fatbergs, that is an issue. But it's looked at out of a very concrete situation that is very personal to a lot of people. So the evaluative meaning is quite a different one from talking in very abstract terms about environmental damage. Similarly, there are examples where we have stopped buying bottled water during coronavirus lockdown. Online shoppers are urged. There, people realize what a pain in the backside plastic water bottles are, because they block these delivery vans. So people who are self-isolating at home and they're really dependent on getting their delivery home, and then they can't order as much because people buy all these bulky water bottles, and you don't really have to buy bottled water. You can just save all this plastic waste and just take it from the tap, and that is fine. But you get a whole different sense of this. And other examples were like people physically fighting in the shop because someone wanted the last batch of water bottles and there was only the one item rule per customer. Or then there was another article where people looked at the increase in hot tub use during the pandemic, because people were spending more time at home, and then they used much more water than they would normally do because they like to sit in a hot tub. So you see, the point I'm trying to make here is that you can look at different meanings, at different value systems, if you change perspective, and that perspective change can come about in interesting ways. And when you then look at water, you can connect all these various things together. And I will return to this in the end. I see I'm running out of time fast, so I really need to get to the point. Where do we go from here? I think what is important is that, especially in view of our digital world, where tools and data is something that is now up for grabs for everyone. Everyone can do now data analysis and use linguistic data. We really need to think about what are the corpus linguistic foundations, what is crucial in terms how we get insights into the language. And here I want to revisit something that I also looked at a long time ago, but I'm now looking at this slightly differently. What I still think is the same. Is the important thing is language is a social phenomenon. All this repetition, all these patterns that we see has to do with the way we behave, the way we use language again and again in certain ways to act, interact, and especially to make sense of the world. This is how we can then observe cultural templates. This is how we can observe textual evidence of our views of the world. Importantly, what we got from these concordances is meaning and form are associated, and there are very many terms, collocations, patterns, lexical items, all sorts of primings, frames, clusters, lots and lots of things. And also we can look at cohesion in terms of networks and patterns across texts. Now, the point that I think is particularly important now is this connection between lexis and larger semantic units. And these are these units where kind of the outer edge of the semantic prosody, so the thing that is so difficult to describe, these evaluative attitudinal meanings, and I've sometimes looked at them also in terms of local textual functions, how they can connect to concepts and ideas and worldviews and values that are kind of bigger than the texts we're looking at. And there are three ways in which we can also look at them in terms of the language that we use. So we can look at the way we label the world around us. So for our water ideas, this has to do with, water is quite a broad term. And you can pick areas of your reality by calling certain types of water river or sea, or you can call something a flood or a drought when you don't have water, or speak about sewage, particular type of water. This is already labeling certain aspects of it. The way you frame problems, too much, too little, too polluted, or a health issue or some other thing, has to do with how you connect to value systems. So how you take the outer edge of the semantic prosody and connect this to a value system, how you connect it to news values, for instance. And what's really interesting then, and that's something we need to look at more, is how do we describe narratives? Because interestingly, in more recent data, you can then get stuff like droughts, floods, fires, storms, wars, and pandemics listed together. And a list gives you an indication of how people put things together. So it's not the individual story of there's a fire in California, there's a flood somewhere in East Anglia, but things come together as, wars, pandemics, storms, fires, floods, and droughts. These are man-made, human-made problems that we have to deal with. And we need to see the narrative of how this has developed to kind of get a sense of how we need to address it. Robbie, I promise I'll wrap it up quickly now. So what we then also need is new types of corpora. So looking at directionality, looking at responses, not, when we use corpora, what we can do very, very well is we can count and we can look at dispersion, we can look at change over time, but we haven't quite got to that stage where we really look at relationships. What is a response to something else that has happened? How does the text respond? And I really like, what Marcello and Robbie are doing with their survey for the lockdown reading, because that is also a way of actually making connections between text and actively getting responses and ideas and reactions. And we could do probably a lot more to also collect and construct corpora that help us to describe things a little bit more like we are also describing spoken language. Who said what to whom? Who tells the stories? And the digital world is interesting there, because in social media, people are looking more now at small stories or small storytelling, and then who controls the narrative and how does it all come together? And we could probably learn something from this for corpus linguistics. Now, I'll talk about this with people who want to send me an email directly, because I don't have time, but I think it's really important that we talk across disciplines. And then that in corpus linguistics, we do more for open research, because we have a lot of tools and a lot of corpora, but we are not quite at that stage yet where we use things like GitHub and open repositories, maybe in the same way as other disciplines, or in a way that we now could. We maybe couldn't do this before, but there are now opportunities. Obviously, it makes you really rather vulnerable, because people can see all the mistakes you've made. And this is why I'm putting up something there that colleagues and I have created, where you can see all the mistakes that we have made. But I think that's a way of learning together, if you can do this. And also open research, we need to speak more to others outside our discipline about the methods that we use to study the language. So it's really team corpus linguistics, that expression, team science. People need to work together. So you need the subject expertise when you work with people in history, in human geography, and all sorts of areas, but you also need technical expertise that is maybe beyond what you as a corpus linguist should know and be able to do. And we need systems to share and look at interoperability. Robbie already mentioned that. And the reason why I want to mention this is public engagement is something that is really important to us as well. And the reason why I thought, I do a podcast, it's not just because it's nice to do and I really enjoy doing it, but I find the listening is so important. So I've given myself the task to say, I want to listen to people that work in areas that are so different from my area. And I want to kind of listen to them to work out, how do they deal with language? They won't use the same terminology as us. They won't explicitly say, I do a linguistic study, but language matters to so many people in so many ways. And if as corpus linguists, we can find a way of really listening, finding out how others assess, evaluate, think about language, that gives us new inspiration for the kind of analyses we can do, for the kind of stories we want to investigate with corpus linguistics. So I'm wrapping this up. So all these points together, the kind of rethinking I want to encourage you to do is basically around opening up to others while at the same time thinking about what we have got. So not think about, oh, maybe there's technology out there that is so far above what I can do, or this tool looks so much flashier than anything I use or work with. It's really about thinking, what's the linguistic insight? What does corpus linguistic mean in terms of what can we get out of the language? And then formulating, expressing this in such a way that other people, other disciplines can connect to this. So basically working towards a more outward looking corpus linguistics. And here, if you want to read more about this, there's something Viola Wiegand and I are writing that is hopefully coming out very soon. And there's something I'm doing with David Hanna that will also give you a bit more in this regard. And I need to stop there because otherwise there isn't time for questions anymore.
Thank you very much, Michaela, for that fantastic plenary. Really interesting and inspirational ideas. I've been following along on Twitter there. I should have mentioned earlier, we have a hashtag. Of course, we have a hashtag, Aston Corpus, and there's been people commenting on there and responding very positively to your messages. Thank you, Michaela. We have time for some questions. So I'll open the floor to, first of all, those of us who are physically in the room. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Michaela? Ramesh.
Hi, Michaela.
Hello, Ramesh.
I was very interested in your analysis of labels, frames, and narratives. I mean, one thing I noticed, you probably said it in another more extended talk, but I was struck by the fact that the labels tended to be singular items and the narratives tended to use the same or similar items, but in the plural. Was that a feature of what you found about labels and narratives?
Yeah. Oh, good point that you're making there, because, you know, if you take the example of the drought, for instance, if you are in a particular story at a particular moment in time, it's about this particular drought. So what do we need to do next week so that this drought will, that we can deal with it. But then, you know, with the narrative, you kind of look retrospectively and you look at other similar events and you find similarities across them, and that is where you then get them in the lists as plural forms. Because, you start to generalize and you assess. You know, it's a bit like what you said at the beginning, you know, where you've got people and events and then you put it together and then it looks a bit different from when you look at it in the individual instance. So I thought, you know, your introduction was super. I thought, well, as if we planned it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mike.
I was very interested in your talk. I thought it was wonderful. I also picked up, like Ramesh, on the idea of the labels and frames, and wanted to have a clearer understanding of what do you actually mean by a label, or how would you define a label? Is it something similar to a concept?
At the moment that is something we're still obviously trying around with, but for now we just take the label as the term that you use to refer to a concept, a thing, something in the real world, you know, because water is such a big, you know, water scientifically is such a big thing, and the way you look at it, you've got water in rivers, you've got water in the sea, and it is a way of describing a particular aspect of it. So it's, at this point in time, it's really just the term, the label, how big the concept gets. That is something we still need to work out, because the frame makes it then bigger and brings in all this other associated meaning with it. So as a kind of almost a snapshot view of it, whereas the narrative then brings it into sequence. So it's kind of this.
Is it a word type then?
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is.
It's the actual form of the word when you say label. Yeah.
Yeah, the form of the word that labels something in reality,
Good,
but we don't want to like go into is that already a concept or how big is it? You know,
No, that's
what we're
fine.
trying to work
Very
out.
clear. Thank you.
Thank
But
you.
Mike, you can see now all this wordsmithing and all the wordsmith questions I always send you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to our Zoom audience. We've had some questions have come through from there on Slido. By the way, I should have mentioned earlier to our Zoom audience, you are visible to us here in the room. So some of you have got your cameras on. More of you are very welcome to have your cameras on, and we can see you. And hello, yes to you. Give you hello. Give you a wave. We've got a question on. Yes, it's great. Yes, it's lovely. Can you? Yes. Oh, there's some more. Oh, here we go. Look at this. Fantastic. Oh, feel a bit kind of creepy at you. No, it's fine. It's a bit sort of Black Mirror-esque. We've got a question from Khalid. I don't know if Khalid would like to actually, if you are there, you'd like to join us in this conversation, and we're going to attempt to actually communicate with you directly. Otherwise, I will just read out your question, but I'll give you a chance to pop up if you want to ask one of your questions. Actually, you've asked two, but you can pick one. Is Khalid there? Oh, yes, I think you are.
Yes, I'm there. Thanks so much.
Thank you. You had a question about CL and data. Perhaps you could ask that one.
Yeah. Well, I think there's a sort of bias when it comes to Corpus linguistics. It looks more concerned with data than with linguistic insights.
So is Corpus Linguistics more concerned with data as opposed to linguistic insights?
Yeah.
Is that? I mean,
That's
on this I would. And this I would absolutely say, no, it isn't. It is really that is what distinguishes us from data scientists, because for data scientists, to them, data is, it's this kind of language data, it's other kind of data, and it's similar methods, and they also need to really work together with other disciplines. But for us, the whole point is about what can we get out of this data analysis from a linguistic point of view. I mean, this is always why, I do a lot of like reading other people's stuff, giving feedback on things. The number of times I have written in my life, a keyword table is not an analysis. Stamp or something like this. There's always, you need to ask, so what? So what do we get from this? What do I learn? What difference does it make? Look at it this way.
Well, I mean, the problem is that every time I read about a paper or an article on Corpus linguistics, I feel myself a little bit lost and drifted with sizable amount of data and, this sense of lost.
Yeah, but I think there's also, and that is all, it's not about making comparisons between disciplines and saying this discipline is better than other. It's just every discipline has that different area of focus. And I think something that corpus linguists focus on a lot is actually knowing the kind of data they're looking at. So we as corpus linguists spend a lot of time thinking about design criteria for corpora, and people who will be in a couple of weeks at the launch of the new BNC, and Robbie, you can tell people stories about how you put stuff together and how you make decisions.
Oh no, only a very very minor part of all that.
It's really about understanding what you get in, and that connects again with concerns in data science at the moment, and data science and algorithm, where people are looking at bias a lot. In terms of, a lot of biases, stereotypes, values that we have in the world, only because you switch off the computer doesn't make your study more objective. You just take the same bias and then look at it in a more computational way. And that is where it's really important to know what the data is and think about design criteria and the construction of your data set.
Thank you. Thank you, Khalid. I just want to ask, whereabouts in the world are you?
I'm from Iraq.
You're in Iraq. Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Khalid, for your questions.
Actually, I got a second question. Maybe it's mentioned in Slido.
Yeah, I'm afraid we won't have time to go through all of the questions that appear on Slido, but I'm sure you'll get a chance to ask other questions all day. Yes, absolutely. And we'll be recording all of the questions on Slido. Thank you, thank you. We have time for one more question in the room, if there is one. Otherwise, I'll take one final question from Zoom. Ellen Lafall, you have a question for Michaela. Are you with us and able to appear?
Oh, hi, Ellen.
Hi, yeah, sure, I can try, if you can hear me. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I was really interested in all aspects, but the point on open science I think is particularly interesting, and I'm wondering what can we do to encourage corpus linguistics to be more open? And when I say we, I mean everyone. So I'm like a PhD candidate. What can I do? What can people, sort of postdocs and profs do? What can the publishing industry do? Because as you said, it does make us vulnerable, and that we expose our mistakes. And I think it's important, but what can we do at our various levels to overcome the barriers that do exist?
Yeah, so that is, that is one of my favorite topics, and I could give a whole talk just an hour on open research, because there is, because one, in the early days, it was a USP of corpus linguistics, where people said what we do is applicable, what we do is in a way open for people to follow and do something with. And I think we probably lost focus on this a little bit, which is also to do with the fact that people are now much more doing in terms of writing their own scripts, doing their own stuff in this way, which is brilliant, which is absolutely super and brings the discipline forward. But they're very easy things of why then not put it on GitHub, and we have, to just give you an example, for the International Journal of Corpus Linguistics, we're currently debating how we work with our data and code policy and things like this. So watch this space, there will be something new out very shortly. But we also had a lot of conversations with people in that area where people say, yeah, but my script isn't so nice. I didn't have the time to really tidy it up, and it doesn't look so good. And, someone helped me to do it, and there's so many people involved, and what do it? But I think that should actually be a sign to say, we need to do it. That isn't to then hide it, but scripts also get better when more people look at them. If you've got something out there, and that has happened to me, where someone then looked at it and said, look, I saw this, how about you do this, this, and the other, and that is actually better. So only by sharing, but we then need to create a way of also behaving in a way, there are standards for doing this. There are ways of encouraging people, and also just a tiny thing that everyone can do, even if they're not writing scripts and if they're not sharing corpora. When you write your methods sections in papers, that is also the way about being open about how you make decisions. And that's another paper I will give somewhere else, is on, reading concordances. People, when they talk about reading concordances, very often you get a sentence like, and then we checked in a concordance to see how it makes, but no one tells you, how did you check in that concordance? What did you actually do? And that's something that has gone out of fashion a little bit, and that is part of the open agenda as well. So there's a lot more, and if you're interested, we can continue this conversation via email.
Finally, Michaela Mahlberg, for your excellent plenary and a wonderful way to open our symposium.